dig into this lecture, I wanted to ask you guys to list a few of your favorite stories in regard to world building specifically. Film or book or video game. What are your favorites? Yeah. Okay. Ooh, John Wick. All right, what do we got here? I think you were priced into saying that one, right? All right. Yeah, go ahead. Firefly? Great. All right, Firefly. Yeah, go ahead. You like The Expanse? All right, let's get one more. Sure, we'll go over on this side because I haven't. Dune. All right, great. Okay, that'll be relevant later. We're going to use those. But let me ask you guys a different question. You are presumably in this class specifically instead of the other creative writing classes, which you might also be taking, but you're here because of world building, right? That's what differentiates this class from the others being offered. This is the sci-fi and fantasy themed creative writing course at the university. So why do you want to learn to build worlds? Why are you building worlds? What is it to you? What does it mean to you to have world building in a story? It means the world to you. Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead.
I need a world that stand ready. Cool designs I have in my head that aren't physically possible.
Okay, all right. Let's write a few of these up. That's one that I noted. The impossible made plausible is one of the purposes of world building, right? To take that impossibility and make it while you're able to suspend disbelief while you're in there. Go ahead. What's that? Theme. So you can play with theme. All right, like that. How does world building play with theme?
Like if you're having, for example, more serious story, you could have like more serious or grudging settings.
Okay. Awesome. What else? What else do you guys got? Why do you like world building and stories? Why do you read world stories with lots of world building?
My real life experience.
Okay. Okay. So can we say maybe sense of wonder and or exploration in regard to that?
I'm feeling greedy.
True explorers follow compass in
Or,
their heart.
you know, we could probably also write down here sheer coolness
Hot on the trail.
to encapsulate those things. What else? Go ahead.
I really enjoy just seeing like a cultural butterfly effect. You change one small thing.
Right, okay. Yeah. I'll write that up. I love how you put that cultural butterfly effect. Butterfly.
Hot on the trail.
Okay, great. Yeah.
The ability to explore real world problems in a world that's
Yep. Yeah. How can we phrase this? What's that? Zootopia. I actually had, what did I write down? Let me look at my list of notes. I wrote down something for this. Yeah. Ability to approach ideas in a fresh way. How about that? Approach.
Got them in my sights.
How do you spell approach? Real world. Yeah, I'll just make that sounds as approach. I totally got it right. Ideas in a kind of disconnected way, right? Disconnected. We'll talk about this. Your ability, you can talk about something without the baggage that it brings to talk about it in a real world setting. And this allows you just kind of to approach difficult ideas in directions that are maybe not as immediately, polarizing. That's a good way to put it, immediately polarizing. Anything else, you guys? Yeah, go ahead. What's that? Reminiscent of the sins. Okay. Play God. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one of my favorite comics on the whole internet, look it up sometime, is Caveman Science Fiction. And this comic is a bunch of caveman science fiction scenarios. And at the end, the moral is, I am play gods. Meaning, oh, I made a mistake. I pretend to be the gods. And really funny. You guys should go read it. All right. Let's talk about this. Because sci-fi fantasy has this weird disconnect that I've noticed, at least in writing it, which is that the setting is both the thing that defines us as sci-fi fantasy writers or sci-fi fantasy works, and is at the same time the least important part of our stories. You may laugh about that, but in most cases I think it is true. Generally, if you have a story with excellent world building but bad characters and story, or bad characters or bad story, you're going to have a worse story than one that does an excellent job of character and story and has weak world building. And so of the three sort of things I talk about that make up our stories, our setting, our plot, and our character, your time is best spent learning how to make engaging and interesting characters, followed by learning how to tell a really good plot, with, in third place, your ability to have a really great setting. Now, ideally, you want to learn to do all three. However, I think there is a tendency to have what we sometimes call world builder's disease. Yes. This is where you become so enthralled with building the world of your story that you never finish world building and never start your story. And if you do start your story, you have spent so much time on your awesome world building that you want to fill every nook and cranny of your story with that world building, and by so doing, you undermine the story that you're actually telling. And so because of this, one of the things I like to talk about when we get to world building, because don't get me wrong, it is important. Having a great world will be a bonus to your story. I like to talk about world building in service of story. Ways that we can use, as has been pointed out on the board, theme, that we can use the world building that we're doing to enhance the specific story we want to tell, so that that world building becomes a big part of that story. And an important part of that story, and not just something that's there like billboards to watch on the way to actually getting to your story. That's what you want to avoid. Now, as a little aside on this, I want to talk about info dumps and about conveying information in a fantasy world or a science fiction world. I often say that I consider the grand skill of writing science fiction and fantasy the single most important thing to learn for sci-fi fantasy, as opposed to other genres, is learning to convey information about your world in a way that is interesting and not boring. And this is a trick to master writing sci-fi fantasy. That's not to say that this will make up for bad characters or a bad story. But if you are doing a good job with those, mastering this, I think, is the single best thing you can do to get yourself picked up by agents, to get passed up to editors, or to, make it to that next round of acquisition, or if you're self-publishing, to make sure that people, when they are reading that first chapter, say, I want to read the next one. And that is to make sure you are conveying your world building without boring people. This can be kind of hard. So I've got a couple tricks to recommend to you on doing this. And the first one is to always think of your world building in service of the story you're telling and in service of making good characters. And if you can find a way that you can convey your setting information through the eyes of your characters in a way that exemplifies who that character is, so that the point of the sentence or the paragraph is actually to give us more information about the character, but you, as a side effect, tell people about the world, it's what you want to do. For a kind of example of this, a metaphor of this, my wife often has trouble getting my children to eat vegetables. This is really super uncommon. I know it's only my children, who won't eat their vegetables. But she realized in the mornings they like to have a smoothie with breakfast. And they really like, because they're little boys, I have 3 little boys, when things look gross. And so putting a handful of spinach into a smoothie and turning it green, they loved. They're like, it is so gross, it looks like snot. Yum, right? This is just how my children are. Oh, it's radioactive goo, yum! And you do that by throwing in a handful of spinach. Well, this is how you want to have your world building gotten across to your readers. You want them to be getting the world building by saying, wow, this story and these characters are so fascinating. Oh, and by the way, I know a whole bunch about Hogwarts now, right? This is how you want to be conveying your world building. And you want to avoid the number one, the encyclopedia entry. A lot of fantasy in its early days, in particular fantasy, some science fiction, would start with an encyclopedia entry. Not very well disguised either. Like you'd start off and it's like, here is the myth of this world. And then there's basically a whole bunch of broccoli or spinach thrown at you where you're like, you're going to have to track who all these gods are. So we're going to give you kind of a boring write-up of the history and lore of this world before we start the book. Or sometimes they were literal encyclopedia entries put in the front or the back of the book. Tolkien. I love Tolkien. Lots of encyclopedia entries. He invented a new subgenre. We can give him a pass. And he still did it better than almost anyone does it. But a lot of encyclopedia entries. It's like, I can't get this all in the story, so I'm going to give you, an encyclopedia. You want to avoid that. Now, you can do this in a couple of ways. One is to start trying to get more of it into dialogue. You run into troubles when you're doing this, however, for a reason we call maid and butler dialogue. Maid and butler dialogue comes from the old stage plays where they would often start the stage play by having the maid and the butler come up onto the stage and be like, as you know, the master is away for the weekend. And the other one's like, yes, and as you know, the lady has been getting very close with the coachman. And they're basically explaining to each other things that they already know. Avoid maid and butler dialogue. It reads really stilted and is kind of a problem. We'll talk about more if we go into dialogue later in the year, but the idea, stilted dialogue is often dialogue that feels like the character is not acting according to their own sincere motivations, but according to the author's motivations and getting out certain information and making the plot happen. So avoid maid and butler, moving things more to dialogue, but also giving us less than you think we need is generally a good example. One of the things I learned in my grad program, and it wasn't from one of the teachers, but perhaps the most valuable lesson I learned was from another student who taught me about something called the pyramid of abstraction. And he said, imagine your descriptions as a pyramid. The goal of your descriptions are to form kind of the base of a pyramid so that you ground a reader into a story so that when you start talking about things that are a little more high level or a little more abstract, or if you're going to go inside the character's head for a little bit and do what we call navel gazing, where the character is ruminating on, oh man, I have all these problems, let me list them off one at a time so that you, the reader, are aware that I'm aware that I have all these problems, right? Whenever you're doing things like this, that sort of stuff is pulling the reader out of the story because it's diversing the reader from the setting, and they become more and more aware of the author doing things. Like if you want to have a character ruminate on the nature of art in a story, then the more you do that, the more, ironically, it will pull the reader out and make them start thinking this is the author giving me a lesson or a lecture instead of the character actually dealing with this. And my friend said, and I really believe this is true, the way that you offset that, because you want to have some of this stuff in stories, is you let the abstract be the tip on the pyramid that you earn by laying your groundwork with concrete language. so that the reader is very firmly set in your world in a real concrete place and time, that then when that character's walking along and starts having a discussion about the nature of art with someone next to them, you are still imagining them walking down the street in this place that you have painted very well, so that you don't have this problem of losing them off in the aether. And this works very well for world building as well, by being able to, you have this character say, well, magic works like this. You're already kind of going into this abstract. It's stuff the reader needs. It's that broccoli, that spinach, but you want to have grounded them first in the setting. And my friend did a really cool thing with me that helped me kind of understand what he meant by abstract versus concrete. And some of you who've watched these lectures before, have talked about this before, will understand that let's just say you've got at the bottom concrete and at the top abstract. Where would you put, if you were going to talk about love, if you're going to say, someone's experiences with love, where is that on the abstract concrete scale? What's that? Yeah, more on the abstract side, right? Love. Right? Now, you can pull that down by making sure you're talking about what love means to this person and the actual emotions. Where would you put, if you say the character saw a dog? Where is that? Dog is way up here. Probably right underneath love, but maybe above it. Because everyone in this room, when you say dog, how many of you imagine the same dog? Almost none of you. How many of you imagine love and are on the same page? My friend's argument, I put it right underneath. His argument was dog is above love in abstractness. More of us, if you just say love, are going to have experienced a similar thing to one another than if you just say a dog, because the picture that pops in your head is going to be completely abstract from, it's going to be completely different from everyone else. Now, if you say it was a mangy little white dog with one leg that was whimpering on the side of the street in a puddle, flaked with mud from the passing, the passing carriage, then you're all imagining a very similar dog, right? And so that pulls dog down into the concrete. Now, there's a lesson to be learned here, however. Down is not always better. We talk about in writing this phrase called show, don't tell, right? And it's become a mantra. It's this thing, it's like, anytime anything's wrong in a story, people be like, well, you didn't show enough. You told too much. And they're often right. But show versus tell is not something to hold up as like the absolute gold standard, because almost always showing more and pulling down on the pyramid abstraction requires what? More words. And so the more words you spend, the more concrete you can generally make things. Now, if you understand this model well, what you're going to do is you're going to learn how to use those more words to pull yourself down rather than just using words that are meaningless. And you will find, if you actually look at your writing, you will be using a lot of meaningless words. You'll be doing a couple of things. I do this a lot in my first drafts. You will be doing what we call a tell then show. This is where your paragraph starts with like a line kind of explaining that, he was a really nervous person. And then your next line is, he sat at the table tapping his pen against it and moving his foot like this. That is what we call a tell then show. The show is enough. You don't need to have a thesis sentence in your paragraph telling us what you're going to then show us, but we do it a lot because as writers, we're trying to organize our thoughts, and then we go on to the show. You will find these all the time still in published books where the author didn't catch that one and delete it out. You want to learn to delete those out. I have a lot of a word that comes up that is very controversial in this is the word suddenly or abruptly. A lot of writers will say, just don't use that, just make it abrupt or sudden, the thing that's happening. I still tend to prefer using the suddenly because it becomes a marker very well to the reader. But this is why we say get rid of the passive voice. Get rid of too many adverbs. Get rid of too many descriptors that don't actually pull you down on the pyramid of abstraction. And you'll find you're doing this a lot. You're using a lot of very's. You know, he was very mad instead of saying he was irate. Irate is further down than very mad, but very mad uses more words. Anytime you can go down by using fewer words, you're almost always wanting to make that change. And you want to get rid of these sentences that'll often just not say anything, or will have lots of just modifier words that don't mean anything, a little bit, and things like that. Like little bit is one I use all the time, whereas I'm going through my revisions, like, I don't need to say that he stumbled a little bit. A stumble is a little fall. It's already in the word. I don't need the a little bit, but I use it all the time. You will find all sorts of things like this that you can cut that will cost you nothing on moving up or down the pyramid abstraction, or things you can cut and replace that will move you down. Learn to do these things to start really grounding your reader in a world that feels very real. Dan Wells, good friend of mine, has advice that if you want the reader to believe you about the big things, that there's this big problem in the political system, you often describe one small thing very concretely that impacts the characters in a way that'll make you really understand this. Saying that, you know, the cantina is a place of a hive of scum and villainy is nowhere near as useful as having two random people decide to bully Luke and almost, you know, get him killed until a hand has to get cut off, right? So grounding people in these scenes, showing them the ideas you want, pulling down on the pyramid of abstraction, good to start grounding your world building. And you will find if you start to do this, then you will have more space in your story to kind of talk about now and then slipping in world building details. This is why it is almost always better to start with your character in a situation where they want something, even if it's not related to the main plot. They can't have it, and we get to see them working proactively to get the thing they want, and we explain only as much world building as you need for that single instance for that character to grab us and ground us in a scene, in a world, before you start to pile on more world building. These things work differently for different stories. I intentionally, in Mistborn, if you haven't read this book, it starts off kind of working to ground you in the world, but the first time that the main character uses the magic, I cut, and you don't see that scene. This is Kelsier attacking the manor house in the early chapters. Do not show it because there's a whole ton of world building I'd have to drop on you to explain the magic, and it works so much better if I hold that off until you are more grounded in the actual setting and characters, and then you get it. Way of Kings, I throw it all at you in the prologue. The second prologue. Right? The one I actually called prologue of the three, I throw it all right at you. Why did I do this? Well, understanding I had already an established audience who already was looking forward to reading about an interesting magic system, knowing I only had to explain one of the many types of magic I was putting into the story, and knowing that this story needed to start off with something dynamic that promised where one of the character arcs was going to go later on, I made the decision in that case instead to lead with a character using the magic. But that increases my learning curve, and that increases the likelihood that someone is going to put the book down and get bored early on. And if you go read reviews of Way of Kings, people who give it low stars often put it down early because the learning curve was so steep. And I wasn't then able to hook them into the characters as quickly because I was spending so much more time on lore and world. That was a risk I was willing to take for that specific story, but it also has a cost to it. So, learn to make things more concrete. Learn to deliver your world building through the eyes of the characters. Robert Jordan was a genius at this. When a character walks in the room and says there's a cup of water sitting on the table, the way they describe that cup of water will tell you a ton about their culture and their history and who they are. When you can describe a cup of water in a way that gives you more world building about a person's culture than most people's 3-paragraph long encyclopedia entries, then you are mastering the grand skill of writing science fiction and fantasy. All right? Questions about these ideas? Yes?
So in Warbreaker, where you did something similar,
Yep.
So, would you say takeaway for that is the excitement?
Oh yeah, it's much easier. Like if you are able to explain, oftentimes in a fantasy book, it is good to lead with the magic, I would say. If you can do it through the eyes of a character who is achieving a goal and what they are doing is intrinsic to the magic, some of the best ways to start fantasy books is indeed in that way. And so here is a problem in the magic, or some obstacle I need to overcome. Here's me using the magic in a simple, easy to understand way that evokes an entire world that's more. Like you can use that small instance of a description of one part of the magic to indicate there's a much larger world to explore, but let's make sure you master this one thing first. That can be a really great way to start a fantasy story. But again, try to keep it grounded in the character's motivations. And a lot of times what's working is character motivation, here's a line of world building. Character motivation, concrete description, here's a line of world building. And you're moving this through. This is why so often you see authors using Watson characters in fantasy novels, apprentice characters. You know, a person who's unfamiliar with the world or setting, getting it explained to them as they're trying to navigate some sort of issue or problem in the world lets you get it out slowly, but it also lets you have these, what we call hang a lantern on it, where the person can be like, I don't understand this, and the other person can say, there's no time to explain, this is the one thing you need to know right now. And then that works really well, but there's a reason why the apprentice plot became the go-to plot in the 80s for fantasy novels. Almost all of them were apprentice plots, all the big ones, where someone young is learning about a fantastical world and then gets introduced to it step by step by some old master so that you, as the reader, can follow that path. That gets really repetitive if it's done too much, which is why in the 90s you saw an explosion of things that didn't do this, like Game of Thrones or whatnot, where it was like, no, we're just going to throw you right in, boom, deal with it, here we go. But then Harry Potter came, and Portal Fantasy is, so Harry Potter is a hard one to use as an example because Portal Fantasies are always going to be very popular in middle grade. They started basically with Alice in Wonderland, and they go all the way through Narnia, all the way up to Harry Potter. And this is because it gives you an easy way to make the Watson character the protagonist, who also gets to go with you and explore this fantasy world. And generally, by genre, as your age group gets older, the more you can count on a steeper learning curve. Middle grade needs the shallowest learning curve in general. YA can get a little steep, and adult, it can be like this. It can be Steven Erikson, right? It's just like, oh, here's a wall. Climb up it by your fingernails, and then you'll love this, right? That is very hard sell in middle grade. I don't know that I've read a book that has had anywhere near that steep a learning curve. Even like something like Sabriel by Garth Nix, which is more YA than middle grade anyway, starts you and then transitions you in, even though the character's part of the world. It's very common to do something like this. So middle grade and YA have different sort of understandings there. But even in adult, sometimes you want to come up with a really shallow learning curve for various purposes. Yeah. Right. World building or magic systems in journal entries. So I do it a lot, right? I use them as epigraphs at the starts of stories because that forces me to dole it out slowly and only use it kind of as flourishes here and there. I tend to like it. I think it works pretty well, but you have to understand there's a percentage of your readership who will not read them. Because of that, anything you're putting in there, you need to be careful to try and reinforce through the story or make not vital to the A plot line of what your story is. You can't always do this, but I often recommend imagining that people are not going to read them or remember them because of the way they are. Majority of your audience will, but you can't count on as much as if it's in the text. And this kind of gets into this other idea of world building and service of story. Like whether you want to use epigraphs or you want to use songs like Grandpa Tolkien did, or whether you want to have a steep learning curve or a shallow learning curve really comes into the question of what are you trying to do with your story and how does your setting enhance it. Let's go to our list over here. Let me ask you this. For those who love the Assassins sort of thing of the John Wick universe, how does the setting of the John Wick universe enhance the story that they're trying to tell?
It sets up the rules of the universe that the characters all have to abide by and establish the consequences of breaking.
Right. This is a very violent, dangerous world where if you transgress a simple rule, it can lead to massive consequences. And the world building is there to warn you that all of these rules are they're very touchy, right? They're very touchy. Anyone else want to talk about John Wick? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. It's an entire world of assassins. I'm going to repeat it for the microphone here. And if John Wick is the best of them all, by showing how cool everyone else is, you then establish how cool he is, just through natural sort of consequences of world building. Star Trek did this sort of thing with Worf all the time. There's actually a TV tropes page on it, where if they wanted to establish how awesome a bad guy was, they had them beat up Worf, because you know how cool Worf was. And if Worf gets beat up, then this person must be cool. They did it enough that Worf, if you actually look at, at what happens in the things, is actually not that tough because people are beating him up all the time. But this is the same sort of idea. By establishing this world, I really like this idea. It happens a lot in espionage stories. That you kind of, like my wife and I say, all right, we're in spy world now. In spy world, you can accept that everybody has a minimum level of spy training, and every character you meet, like there are just certain tropes that if you're watching Alias, or if you're watching even a James Bond movie, that you just be like, you know what, this is spy world. There's going to be tons of double crosses because no one trusts each other because they live in spy world, and they've just all been betrayed 100 times. And using the setting to